Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight we invite you into the quiet heart of an English market town, a place of gossip, tea, and tidy streets. Until one night, a scream was heard. A scream from a locked coffin. Before we open that coffin, I want to know, where are you listening from tonight? Are you at home, lights dimmed, waiting for the story to unfold? Tell me, what would you do if you heard a scream in the night and discovered it came from a place where the dead are supposed to be silent? Hold your breath, keep your ears sharp, and don't look away. Because in Flaxborough, even the quietest streets can echo with secrets. All right then, shall we begin? The Flaxborough and District Horticultural Society enjoyed the kind of tranquility that can only be achieved by people who quarrel about geraniums. Their annual show, held in the municipal market hall under a ceiling that hummed like a kettle, had begun with a customary procession of sturdily coaxed vegetables, self-effacing cakes, and vases of flowers that looked as though they regretted being chosen. The mayor, who preferred chrysanthemums to ratepayers, moved among the exhibits with a silver badge on his chest and a look of civic mercy on his face. It might have passed for an excellent afternoon if the undertaker had not come. Clegg & Son, funeral furnishers and motor hirers, read a discreet card propped against an oblong object near the raffle table. The oblong object was a coffin, Victorian in design, with black japanning, handsome brass screws, and rope handles fat as dockyard serpents. It had been lent for the show's Heritage Craft Corner, a late inspiration of Councillor Babel Smith, who nursed a belief that instructional gloom made for admirable culture. "Do you suppose it's empty?" whispered Mrs. Emmeline Tiddy, who organised the WI preserves with autocratic good cheer. "Let us hope so," replied the vicar's wife, Mrs. Prowse, in a tone that begged the Almighty not to take advantage of her politeness. Mr. Clegg himself, a narrow gentleman whose face had seen things but was too tactful to admit it, supervised his exhibit with a ceremonial air. Beside him hovered his assistant, Will Huggins, a young man with a fledgling mustache, an expression of permanent apology, and a suit with knuckles at the elbows. "Purely illustrative," Mr. Clegg assured those who paused. "We are, as the card says, both funeral furnishers and motor hirers, though no one is obliged to combine the services." A cluster of school children regarded the coffin with rapture. One boy asked if the handles would take his weight. Mr. Clegg advised him gently to weigh his soul instead. Up on the dais, the mayor pinned a rosette to a cabbage that had the dignity of a footstool. A polite applause pattered and subsided. A woman with the anxious pride of a novice hovered over a Victoria sponge as though it might run off if not watched. The air had that curious companionability of fairs where no one is quite sure what to do next. It was then, during a lull between the raffle reminder and the brass band's second attempt at Scarborough Fair, that the first scream came. It arrived muffled, like something thought better of, and seemed to rise from the floor. People looked at one another, counted to 3 in their heads, and waited to see if the matter would apologize. It did not. There was a second cry, louder, unmistakably human and terrified. The sound came, everybody knew at once, from inside the coffin. There was a silence in which even private thoughts grew self-conscious. Then the market hall refilled with noises that were socially acceptable for alarm, exclamations, phrases beginning, "I say," and "Now look here," and the mayor dropping his rosette pin with a tiny, treacherous ping. "Good heavens," said Mrs. Prowse, which was possibly both prayer and opinion. Mr. Clegg's expression did something complicated. He went first pale, then dutiful, then, very quickly, professional. "Will," he said to his assistant, "the key." Huggins patted his pockets in a muscular panic. The scream came again, tremulous and furious. The nearest child began to cry for reasons of fair play. "It's locked, Mr. Clegg," Huggins blurted, as though this were a confession. "Of course it is locked," said Mr. Clegg very levelly. "That is the function of a lock." "Then for pity's sake open it," cried Mrs. Tiddy, who was not usually in favour of innovation. A small, consequential crowd formed. The coffin lay upon trestles, dignified even under suspicion. Huggins, having investigated the least promising pockets, produced from somewhere a squat brass key attached to a loop of black tape. He inserted it, quivering. The key would not turn. "Try the other way," someone suggested, the English solution to metaphysics. Huggins tried. The lock remained as aloof as a duchess. "Stand aside," called Councillor Babel Smith in the voice of a man who, if he had ever stood aside, had not enjoyed it. He placed both hands upon the lid as though prayer might be hydraulic. The lid did not acknowledge his effort. The screaming inside, however, became a banging, sudden and sickening. The mayor looked around for an authority that would absolve him. Authority arrived by means of a police constable, P.C. Thacker, whose great talent in life was appearing as if he had been present all along. He took in the coffin, the key, and the alarming noise with the air of a man displeased to find a rule being broken without paperwork. "No one touch anything," he directed, which is a phrase designed chiefly to comfort the speaker. He tapped his radio and used the words "Market Hall," "coffin," and "screaming" in a voice that carefully avoided opinion. Meanwhile, a man with a toolbox, introduced to those nearest as Mr. Elgin, plumber, offered a flat screwdriver of respectable width. Huggins looked at his employer, who administered the smallest of nods. The brass screws turned reluctantly, like old men obliged to rise for the anthem. The lid, however, refused to lift. "Pilfered panels sometimes swell," Mr. Elgin observed helpfully. "Not in my line," said Mr. Clegg with professional chill. "Will?" Huggins slid his fingers under the rim and pulled. A stitch in his cheek twitched. The banging stopped. The silence that replaced it had a personality. At that moment another figure entered the circle, not hurriedly, but as if a question in the air had requested him. Inspector Purbright had the mild courtesy of a bank manager and the patience of an auditor. His gaze, resting on people rather than objects, had a way of making the latter explain themselves anyway. He listened to Thacker's low recital without removing his hat, then looked at the coffin as one might look at a letter that had arrived unstamped. "Good afternoon," he said to it. "It was screaming," Mrs. Prowse told him, flustered at bringing church business into police affairs. "From inside." "People do occasionally," Purbright answered. "With practice, most manage not to." He nodded at Mr. Clegg. "Shall we have it open?" The screws came free at last and placed themselves upon the trestle with a faintly accusatory glitter. Two men lifted the lid and set it upright against the raffle stand, where it reflected the hall in its varnish like a fishmonger's mirror. The coffin was empty. There was the white satin lining, tufted and faintly theatrical. There was a ruffled pillow with a suggestion of having been considered, and there was, one or two thought they saw it, a slight depression where a head might have rested, as if memory had weight. The smell that rose was not of anything sacred. It was wintergreen, some strong liniment, the medicinal cheeriness of changing rooms. "But," said the mayor, leaving the sentence to sign for itself. "Empty," repeated Councillor Babel Smith, who liked his facts at least twice. "Then who or what was screaming?" asked Mrs. Tiddy, now that it could be asked without indecency. Purbright did not answer. He leaned in a little and regarded the pillow, then the satin at either side where finger marks might have been if satin respected fingers. He placed his hand very lightly into the coffin, not quite touching the lining, the gesture oddly ceremonial. His eyes travelled, unhurried, to the brass plate at the foot, unengraved, waiting. "Mr. Clegg," he said amiably, "when last did you see your assistant's face?" Huggins jumped. "Just now, sir. Only I did go into the yard for a smoke. 5 minutes, perhaps 6. While the coffin was unattended," Purbright said. It was not quite a question. During the cabbage, Huggins added, as if that improved matters. Let us breathe, shall we? Murmured Purbright, looking around at the crowd, and make room for breath. Breath returned in whispers. Gossip, which had been pressing against its leash, bounded off at once. The woman who ran the station buffet, Beryl Clee, told a neighbor that she had once read of a man buried alive in Brussels and had never since trusted anything Belgian. The vicar wondered if it was a rehearsal, by the council he meant, for something to do with emergency planning. Mr. Elgin offered more tools on principle. Purbright's gaze paused on a small thing, so small that it had not yet been granted narrative status. On the trestle beside the brass screws lay a smudge of color, a scrap of something red against the white satin edge. He looked at it, not as a clue, but as if it had asked for courtesy. Then, with the manner of a man reminding himself to post a letter, he glanced at the coffin's underside of lid, propped upright like a parson's conscience. "Sergeant Love is on his way?" he asked Thacker quietly. "Yes, sir." "Good." He straightened. "Mr. Clegg, will you kindly tell us why the lock resisted its key?" Clegg's mouth tightened as if around a pipe that wasn't there. "Someone had turned the latch from within, Inspector. That is evident from the give I felt when young Huggins applied the key. It is not usual." "Not usual," Purbright agreed, his tone warm with appreciation of the phrase. He looked once again at the coffin, a long black box that, even empty, managed to hold an argument. "Not usual at all." The brass band, which had been conferring on whether to play anything again, struck up a wavering bar of Annie Laurie before thinking better of it. Somewhere a jar of chutney gave way to its social pressure and cracked, releasing a tang that tried gamely to pass for cheerfulness. It was Mrs. Prowse who saw it first, and then pressed a hand to her mouth in that way clergymen dislike because it suggests they are responsible for everything unpleasant. "Inspector," she said, "do excuse me, but that writing." All eyes turned to the underside of the coffin lid, which, now the light had arranged itself, displayed a message in smudged crimson. The letters were capital, large, and, as several persons declared, clearly formed by the pressure of a lipstick used with energy. The words were backward, as if scribbled hastily on a surface that would be lowered and never seen. They read once one's mind had performed the necessary gymnastic. "Tonto 33N Saito 3im, which thought the more literate and said the less, could only mean, when viewed correctly, I'm not dead yet." There was a ripple through the hall that began as laughter and ended as dread. Someone whispered, "A joke, surely." Someone else replied, "Not a very English one." Purbright looked at the message without frowning and for rather longer than the mayor considered decent. Then he turned to Mr. Clegg with the faint air of a man remembering a recipe. "When this lid was last unscrewed before today?" "Last Tuesday, Inspector," Clegg said, recovering his stiffness. "We polished it for the exhibition. I can answer for that." "And since then," Purbright said gently, "you have had no lady in your workshop anxious to express herself with cosmetic eloquence?" Clegg's blink was almost devout. "Certainly not." Said Purbright. His eyes moved past the undertaker to the crowd, where expressions rearranged themselves in those careful ways that are the English contribution to theatre. He saw in quick succession startlement that was practiced, indignation rehearsed, guilt one rehearsal, from confidence. He also saw that Mrs. Beryl Clee of the station buffet, large handbag, larger opinions, was not among them, though she was the sort to attend anything with jam involved. A small, harried woman in a green cardie tugged at the inspector's sleeve. "Beg pardon, sir. You don't know me. I'm Ivy from the Oxfam stall, but I thought you ought to hear. There was a lady here not half an hour since, looking at that very thing. She touched the lid, oh, just so, and said, quite distinct, 'It's warmer than you'd think.' Then off she went. I thought, well, you know how people are. But now..." Purbright inclined his head. "And this lady? Blonde hair set like shellac, bit of fox at the collar, though it's not the weather, gloves too tight, the type that laughs at men's jokes to keep them in order." "Thank you," said Purbright, who had met that type. The mayor, finding that the scene persisted without him, resumed authority. "Inspector, this is intolerable. If this is a prank, it is an obscene one. If it is not, well, it is worse. You must insist that—" Purbright was looking toward the market hall entrance, where the town's little traffic of faces came and went like headlines. There, framed between the notices for second-hand prams and surplus leaks, stood a boy in a postman's jacket far too big for him. He held an envelope with black edging and the courtly horror of funeral stationery. His eyes were bright with having been entrusted with something and terrified by what it was. He swallowed, saw the inspector's gaze, and came forward. The envelope bore, in large, florid hand, the name Mrs. Beryl Clee, and beneath it the words, "To be read before interment." "But Mrs. Clee isn't—" began Mrs. Tiddy. "Interred," finished the vicar's wife faintly. The boy extended the letter. Purbright took it with measured care, as though refusing to let the whole decide what it meant. He turned it over. The seal, black wax, plain, was unbroken. From somewhere behind them, very far off and yet unmistakably within the hall, came a small sound, like a breath trying to be brave. It was a woman's voice, no more than a whisper, and it said, no one would later agree on the exact words, something that could have been either "here" or "hear me." The twist of silence that followed had nerves. Purbright, still holding the envelope, looked from the coffin to the crowd, and finally at the shining message on the lid that insisted both on life and on panic. He did not smile. He merely nodded once in that patient way of his which suggested that the town had decided to present him with one of its delicate jokes, and he, in return, would show it the courtesy of taking it seriously. "Constable," he said quietly, "we shall close the hall for the moment. Kindly ask the band to save their breath, and if anyone knows, with certainty, where Mrs. Beryl Clee is, shall be grateful to hear it now." No one did. Constable Thacker did as bidden with the relief of a man handed back his routine. He closed the big doors to the market hall with their municipal reluctance and set the brass band to stillness by the novel expedient of looking at them. People shifted into polite clumps, some near the jam, some near the exit, most where they could see without appearing to want to. Councillor Babel Smith attempted to supervise their composure. The mayor recovered his rosette and wore it like a defense. Purbright spoke first to the boy with the mourning envelope. The lad said he had been sent from the sorting office because it were marked urgent in them words, and that the postmistress wouldn't have him take it to the station if the addressee was at the show. "You don't keep the dead waiting," she had added, with professional piety. He'd been told to put it in Mrs. Clee's own hand, if possible, or into police custody, failing that, and he'd breathed very carefully ever since. "Thank you," said Purbright, as if the boy had performed a delicate surgery. He slipped the sealed letter into his inner pocket without comment, and the boy's shoulders came down a quarter-inch because the world had accepted it. He turned to Mr. Clegg. "You brought the coffin yourself?" "My van, Inspector. Will here and I carried it in. The hall porter saw to the trestles. We arrived an hour before opening to be out of the way of posterity." "Who else touched it?" "Everyone who can't keep their hands to themselves," murmured Clegg. Aloud, "Spectators." Councillor Babel Smith would not be prevailed upon to refrain from tapping. Children, naturally. No one with authority until just now. Purbright looked at the lock. It was a respectable, old-fashioned device with a round mouth and opinions about privacy. "From inside," he repeated softly, recalling Clegg's phrase. "A curious direction." "It will be made for those who die in a mood, sir," said Huggins, and then blushed so hotly that it looked like guilt until one noticed his age, which made it merely youth. "Your 5 minutes' smoke, Mr. Huggins. Where?" Backyard, sir. By the bins. You can see the carriageway. I weren't long. Mr. Elgin were talking at me about drainage. Was the coffin unattended? It didn't look attended, Huggins admitted. A small murmur at the edge of the group was Ivy of the Oxfam stall, who found that when one had once spoken to an inspector, one wished to again. Begging pardon, sir, the lady with the fox collar that I told you of. She went out by the side door soon after. She carried a hat box. I did notice because it had one of them paper straps, like from a proper shop, not Woolworth's. Colour. Black with a gold oval, like a fancy footprint. The town has only one shop that pretends to ovals, murmured Purbright, glancing without emphasis at Councillor Babel Smith, whose wife's drapery business did indeed announce itself with a gold lozenge that looked like an aspirant's badge. Babel Smith, who was reviewing his constituents, missed the glance, an inconvenience he often accepted in his career. Sergeant Love arrived with an economy of bustle that said he had come at once without being seen to run. He took in the coffin, the message scrawled in lipstick, the genteel stampede of people trying not to be involved, and produced a notebook that made them more so. Love, who was handsome in the way that reassures anxious citizens that their town has at least one sensible man in a suit, listened attentively while Purbright narrated the bare essentials with the dignity of a minute's taker. When he had finished, Love's pencil remained poised. "Mrs. Beryl Clee," he said. "Absent." "And wanted," said Purbright. "We'll go to the station." The mayor thought the inspector ought to remain on the scene of outrage, but Purbright assured him that Thacker, who had once dealt with a brawl in a pigeon-fancying club without shedding blood, could be relied upon to hold the fort in the lid. He asked Thacker to take names and to invite anyone who remembered hearing the scream before anyone else to stand where they had been at the time. "They won't," he added, "but their attempts will be of interest." The station had its Sunday face on, which is to say it looked slightly surprised to be employed. The tea-urn at the buffet muttered like a retired colonel. A back in 2 minutes card, written in a penmanship that had subdued many jam orders, hung at an angle that admitted defeat. Behind the counter, a tray of buns had developed a skin not unlike English diplomacy. Station Master Gedge, who wore his cap as if it were keeping thoughts from escaping by air, met them with professional melancholy. "Mrs. Clee has not, in point of fact, been in 2 minutes for nearly an hour," he said. "We thought perhaps the flower show had detained her on a matter of sponge." "Anyone see her leave?" asked Love. Miss Vesti from the parcel office saw her nip across to the ladies with her handbag and the day's takings book. Gedge paused with the benevolent cruelty of all public announcers. She did not return with either. The ladies' waiting room had a smell of soap and literature. A mirror over the washstand bore a crescent where lipstick had been renewed with an attention that suggested a public performance. The attendant, Mrs. Baines, held firm views on the modern use of facilities and expressed them in a commentary that contained only 3 actionable words, none of which she believed a policeman would hear. There was the blonde, with the little dead animal round her neck like a sin, she concluded. There was our Beryl, puffing a bit from the stairs and saying, "Well, if I don't make a corpse today, I'll make a scene," which I took as her little joke. Then, Inspector, I smelt wintergreen, quite strong. I keep a clean house. It weren't me. "Wintergreen," said Purbright, "the perfume of courage among athletes and the elderly." Mrs. Baines nodded as if the entire Botanical Society had been brought in to corroborate. The blonde went out sharpish with a hat box. Mrs. Clee went too, with her handbag and a face like she'd remembered the gas. The cloakroom ledger recalled the blonde more certainly than any human memory would ever do. Under the 12th of December entry, Hatbox, Emser Birch, 1 day. The attendant described M. Birch as one of your tidy ladies who make you tidy whether you like it, with gloves straining at the seams and a smile that did not intend to prove anything. "Ticket number?" asked Love. 73. Love's hand dipped and rose. He had the ticket inside half a breath. It had been among the deceased buns, where the clerk had taken change and given forgiveness. The attendant looked affronted by the ease, which is the cloakroom's equivalent of pride. They asked for the article. The attendant returned with a black hat box marked in a gold oval. Daphne's of Flaxborough since 1922. Purbright considered it with a civil interest, and then, because the hour had begun to gather consequences, opened it on the counter under the solemn witness of the station clock. Inside lay a coil of satin cushion, white and puffed like a slice of the coffin's lining. There was also a compact reel-to-reel machine no bigger than a biscuit tin, with a flat microphone on a lead and, clamped to its top with tape that looked bitten off, the alarm movement from a cheap bedside clock. The reel wore a paper collar. "Try 2, loud." A tube of lipstick, red with aspirations to theatre, had rolled into a corner and marked the cardboard with a smear that had a family resemblance to the writing beneath the coffin lid. There was, too, a small brown bottle whose label, losing bravely to age, announced methyl salicylate, wintergreen, rub gently. The cap was greasy with recent use. Love whistled very gently. Gedge said, "Oh," and by saying it, kept the station from a more vulgar exclamation. "The box screams," said Purbright mildly, "at a time to be chosen by the fellow who married the clock to it. One has only to pull the alarm pin, set the hand, and await hysteria." Then the screaming at the hall, began Love. "Was punctual," said Purbright, "and quite, possibly empty of fear." The reel-to-reel machine had a little window through which the tape made its cautious way. Love, who had once repaired a wireless with a spoon out of poverty and pride, glanced at the connections. "Power." "Dry cells," murmured Purbright. "There will be a tin for them somewhere, perhaps in Mrs. Baines's waste bin." Mrs. Baines, fetched, discovered among the cosmetic debris of the day a pair of heavy batteries rolled in a torn paper bag that bore, with felicity, the legend Daphne's. Millinery and modes. She was divided between eagerness to clean and reluctance to discard evidence in front of policemen. Purbright thanked her as though she had offered tea and returned his attention to the hat box. "Who deposited it?" Love asked the attendant again, not because he doubted, but because repetition sometimes shakes loose accuracy. "The tidy blonde?" the attendant repeated, growing defensive of her description. "Ticket 73. Said she'd be back after the horticulture. I remarked on the season. She remarked on nothing." Gedge cleared his throat elaborately. "And Mrs. Clee left her handbag," he said in the long-suffering tone of a man urging a plot along. "It is in my office because Miss Vesti will not be responsible for other people's despair." The bag was earnestly practical, with a clasp that snapped as if correcting you. Inside were the takings book, a pencil with teeth marks, a sheaf of chits for tea and buns, a folding fork of the sort given away to campers, and, because life is not without modest pleasures, a little purse containing exactly the kind of coins that make change possible in a difficult world. At the very bottom, in the pocket where propriety keeps its last resort, lay a left luggage ticket stub of the complimentary kind to 73 torn by a hand that had hesitated. "She meant to fetch it," Love said. "Or meant us to," said Purbright, not cruelly. There was also, in a flat side compartment, a church memorial leaflet printed for no one in particular. "Order for the burial of the dead." Hymns suggested. In the margin, a hand that had been busy all its life had penciled "No." 184, only a vicar in tune, and beneath, "Caterer, extra ham." The ham had been underlined 3 times in the manner of one who knows human nature. Purbright touched none of these things for longer than courtesy required. He looked instead at the wintergreen bottle and then at Love. "The smell in the coffin," he said. "An imperfect actor's friend. It emboldens and it lingers. Whoever set the device prepared her nerves, or someone's, and decorated her letters afterwards." "Her," said Love. "Or a woman in a man's plan," said Purbright, which is the English compromise between detective work and gallantry. Gedge, who had known Beryl Clee since the era of boiled sweets by ration card, looked at the takings book with a melancholy that was very nearly familial. "She was here at 11:30, he said. "I signed her delivery docket for luncheon pies. She told me that if the mayor's speech ran over, she would sell him his own words back to him between bread. She had a way." "Who quarreled with her lately?" asked Love. Gedge examined his conscience and chose municipal truth. "The Dramatic Society have been loud about the badness of her sandwiches," he said, "which is to say they were good but insufficient. The treasurer used words like exploitative monopoly, and she replied with phrases my assistant did not record verbatim. Also, there was talk that Mrs. Clee had been seen out after hours with our porter. Strictly speaking, ex-porter, Mr. Liversedge. His wife is a weather system of her own." "Mrs. Dora Liversedge," said Love, with the resignation of a man consulting his memory and finding it stocked with local thunderclaps. "Blonde, fox collar, gloves like armor." "Daphne's best customer," added Gedge, as if that established her character beyond appeal. Purbright did not make a note. He stood for a moment at the buffet window looking out at the platform, where a bench waited with the patience of all furniture, obliged to hear confidences. The urn muttered. A train beyond the far points hooted like a person trying not to laugh. He reached into his pocket and took out the black-edged envelope, turning it between his fingers without tearing the seal. "To be read before interment," he said quietly. "Legal minds might say that condition has not yet been met in any sense. But there is a woman whom we cannot find, and a machine by which another can scream, without the inconvenience of lungs. We shall borrow the sense." He broke the seal with the unemotional dispatch of a man opening a bill and unfolded a single sheet of thick paper on which a hand, both bold and uncertain, had written, "Mrs. Beryl Clee, Station Buffet. You will receive what the town has owed you for 11 years. Keep to the plan, do not cry early, and the debt will be paid in full. If you fail, if you run, you will hear the rest, and so will they. A friend in mourning." There was, tucked behind the sheet, an order slip printed with Clegg and Son, funeral furnishers and motor hirers. In the space for particulars, someone had filled in, "Demonstration coffin for flower show. Lid latch to be serviceable from inside. Delivery gratis by arrangement with council." The signature line bore a flourish that could have belonged to either generosity or malice. Daphne Babel Smith. Love drew in his breath and then, because he had learned time from his inspector, let it out again without opinion. "So," he said, "the council." "Or the council's lady," said Purbright, almost kindly, "who may have signed a paper without reading its entreaties. People often do where culture is concerned." He refolded the letter and placed it back in its envelope as if one day it might wish to be original again. "We shall speak to Mrs. Babel Smith," he said, "and to Mrs. Liversedge, and to anyone who has been owed something for 11 years. He looked once more at the little machine in the hat box and at the lipstick that had run a rehearsal beneath a lid. "Meanwhile, we will ask the market hall whether it heard a scream or whether it merely listened for one." As they turned to go, Miss Vesti of Parcels darted from her window with an urgency more often reserved for telegrams. "Inspector, Sergeant, don't be cross, but a gentleman left this to be forwarded to Mr. Clegg a quarter of an hour ago. If he asks," he said. She held a small card, cream, engraved with a wreath at its head and, in a hand that had practiced elegance until it became impudence, the words, "No flowers." "The sandwiches will suffice." Miss Vesti shivered, though it was not a draughty station. "He had on a morning coat like for a wedding," she said, "but his smile were for funerals." Purbright accepted the card. "Thank you," he said. Outside, a train slid in with a sigh, as if the town were a bed too soft for its own good. He and Love stepped through the buffet door into the light that respects no secrets and began to walk back to where the town, polite and watching itself, waited to see who among it had pulled the pin on a small clock and, with it, on something older. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love returned from the station buffet with the envelope, the mocking card, and the hat box device that had so convincingly screamed in place of a human throat. They walked without hurry, as if escorting their evidence like an elderly aunt. Flaxborough preferred its mysteries delivered slowly, and Purbright was not the man to disconcert it by haste. The market hall still had its congregation, somewhat thinned by excuses of weak constitutions and imaginary errands, but dense enough to hum with speculation. Constable Thacker, flushed but proud, had arranged the townsfolk into a semblance of order, which in Flaxborough meant people had found new places to gossip while claiming to wait their turn. At the coffin's side, Mr. Clegg looked the picture of offended dignity. The screws were back in their sockets, though not all the way, and he stood beside his exhibit with the manner of a man who had lent his piano for a recital and found it used for a dog show. Huggins, beside him, looked as if he longed to crawl into the coffin himself, empty or not. Purbright set the hat box gently upon a trestle, where its gold oval badge from Daphne's caught the overhead light like a smug wink. A ripple went through the onlookers as they craned to see. The mayor cleared his throat loudly in case he might reassert civic authority, but Purbright spared him no glance. "Ladies and gentlemen," the inspector said mildly, "this box is not intended for hats. Its contents are somewhat louder. Sergeant Love will demonstrate." Love, with the air of a conjurer who regrets his trick, showed the reel-to-reel device and explained how the alarm clock had been wired to it. He produced the lipstick-stained message and the wintergreen bottle as supporting actors. A woman gasped, whether at the mechanical ingenuity or at the thought of lipstick wasted. It was impossible to say. "So the coffin," said Councillor Babble-Smith, "was never occupied. The screams, merely machinery." "Merely," Purbright agreed, though their effect was human enough. People screamed with it, which was rather the idea. A thin voice near the front, Mrs. Tiddy, ventured, "But who would make such a cruel thing?" "And why?" Purbright's eyes travelled to the coffin lid and back to the crowd. "To frighten Mrs. Tiddy. Frightening is a pastime much enjoyed in towns where people must otherwise occupy themselves with tea and chrysanthemums. But this was no prank for amusement's sake. It was timed, placed, and furnished with the appearance of life. I'm not dead yet, to suggest that someone among us was, or wished to be thought, entombed alive." The vicar's wife shuddered in a manner she reserved for sermons about revelations. At this, Huggins blurted, "But then what about Mrs. Clee, sir? She weren't here for her stall, and they say she's gone missing." His words came in one breath, spilling like marbles on a floor. The gossip that followed was eager, all fragments and overlaps. Some swore they had seen Beryl Clee laughing at 11, others insisted she had hurried off pale as paper. A rumor had already seeded itself that she was in league with the undertaker. Another, contradictory but no less entertained, held that she was being punished by him for failing to pay for sandwiches at his brother's funeral. Purbright lifted his hand slightly, not to silence, but to slow the noise. Mrs. Clee left her station buffet unattended, and her bag behind her. In that bag was a ticket linked to this hat box. She has not returned to either. The question is not whether she screamed in the coffin. She did not. The question is why someone wished us to believe that she had, or might. He let that notion travel across the hall, watched it settle in people's faces like a draft moving curtains. It was Councillor Babble-Smith who finally barked, "Inspector, this grows intolerable. If my wife's name has been mentioned, it is only in connection with her tireless service to the town's cultural heritage. She signed a form for the coffin as a civic contribution, nothing more." "Daphne Babel-Smith," murmured someone at the back. "Always had a flair for drama." Purbright inclined his head gently to the counsellor. "We shall speak with Mrs. Babel Smith, naturally, but the fact of her signature does not alone create guilt. Many things are signed in Flaxborough with little attention to their consequences. Marriage registers, for instance." That earned a titter, quickly smothered, but it had the advantage of loosening tension. Then Ivy from the Oxfam stall piped up again. "Begging pardon, but if it was Mrs. Liversedge you wanted, I did see her fox fur, I'm sure of it, near the raffle." She were speaking sharp to someone, I couldn't see who. A stir, for Mrs. Dora Liversedge was well known for her temper and for the alarming shade of her rouge. Her husband, late of railway porterhood, had the timidity of a man who knows that silence is his strongest defence. Sergeant Love glanced at Purbright. "Shall I?" "Presently," said the inspector. His eyes had gone back to the coffin, not the lid this time, but the side trestle where the screws had been laid earlier. There, faint as old rust, was the red smudge he had seen before. He touched it with a handkerchief, and it left a mark, a faint residue of lipstick again, not the rust it might have pretended to be. Someone had tried the coffin lid more than once. "Inspector," the mayor said with forced bravery, "what do you suppose has become of Mrs. Clee? The town cannot rest until she is found." Purbright folded his handkerchief carefully and returned it to his pocket. "Then the town must not rest. Sergeant, let us speak to Mrs. Liversedge. Mr. Clegg, I should be obliged if your assistant remains with us. He has an honest face, which may yet save him." This, spoken in such mild tones, left Huggins crimson and trembling with eagerness to be of use. They found Dora Liversedge in a side corridor, applying powder with a hand that had conquered several mirrors. She greeted the inspector with a smile sharp enough to slice bread. "Well, if it isn't our law, you'll want to know about poor Beryl, I suppose. Everyone always does." Her tone implied that Beryl's name had been more frequent than prayer in Flaxborough gossip, which was not untrue. "You saw her today, Mrs. Liversedge?" "Saw her? I heard her, Inspector. She was making her usual noise about pies. I told her she ought to keep her voice for hymns. She told me she had more customers than I had friends. And then she went off with her handbag. I thought nothing of it. Beryl was always rushing, as if time were hers to order. If she's missing, it won't be for long. You can't miss her. She'll be where there's pastry." Her eyes darted towards the hat box carried in Love's arms. "What's that, then? Her luggage?" "Not quite," Purbright said, and explained as much as politeness allowed. Dora's face tightened, though whether with recognition or envy of the lipstick he could not say. "Not my shade," she sniffed, "and if someone tried to put Beryl in a box, I'd say they'd need a bigger one." Love, bristling at her flippancy, said, "She may be in danger, Mrs. Liversedge." "Danger? Beryl?" Dora gave a laugh like glass on stone. "Inspector, the only people in danger round her were the ones who tried to stop her talking." Purbright thanked her with courtesy and drew Love aside. "Notice the fox collar. Notice the gloves. Notice also her certainty that Mrs. Clee is alive and mobile. You think she knows where she is?" "I think she knows more than she has offered," Purbright said, "which in Flaxborough is the same thing." As they returned to the hall, they were met by Thacker, flustered with news. "Inspector, there's been a discovery, by the coal yard at the station. A basket with cloths inside, and blood, sir. Quite a bit of blood." The crowd, sensing change, pressed nearer, their faces lit by curiosity and fear in equal shares. The coffin lay behind them, lid propped, the lipstick words glowing faintly under the electric lamps like a joke retold too often. The hat box rested smugly on its trestle, and Purbright, hat tilted a little against the light, stood in the midst of them with the expression of a man who has been handed not one puzzle but several, each pretending to belong to the other. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "let us go see about this basket. If it is blood, we must decide whether it belonged to a crime or to Flaxborough's sausages." And with that, the investigation took its next step. the town following close behind in gossip, as certain of its own importance as if the whole affair had been staged for its benefit alone. Inspector Purbright walked with his steady, courteous pace down to the station's coal yard, Sergeant Love and Constable Thacker in his train like younger clerks attending their master. The late afternoon had taken on that thin light which in Flaxborough seemed to turn all things municipal into sepia photographs. The coal yard smelt of dust, tarpaulins, and memories of hard winters, but now there was another smell, sharp, iron-like, unmistakable. The basket was ordinary enough, a stout wicker hamper such as one might send to boarding school filled with socks and jam, but this one was half-lined with cloths and sawdust, both of which were spattered with dark stains that looked fresh against their pallor. Someone had already attracted a small audience of railwaymen who stood at the approved distance for shock, smoking with indignation that they had not found it themselves. Purbright bent over the basket without touching it. He breathed in, only slightly. "Blood," he said softly, as if making a note to himself. "But not so much as to empty a body." Love crouched nearer, nose wrinkled. "Animal, do you think?" "Possibly." Purbright pointed to a corner of the cloth where the stain had soaked irregularly. "See how it has clotted. It may be pig. The town butcher sends plenty by train, and yet why conceal it with cloths and tuck it away among coal?" Constable Thacker, eager to be relevant, said, "Sir, it were found by young Stanley, the porter. He were fetching in his bike from the wall and saw the stains seeping. He says no one left it, not while he were about." "Then someone left it while he was not," murmured Purbright. Love straightened. "Could it be Mrs. Clee's blood?" "That," Purbright said, "is what the town will think, and very quickly, which may be precisely what was intended." A mutter passed among the onlookers at the idea. One man said, "Poor Beryl." Another said, "About time." Both spoke with equal sincerity. Purbright directed Thacker to have the basket taken carefully to the station for analysis. Not of a scientific kind, which in Flaxborough meant the sergeant squinting at it after tea, but of a thoughtful kind, which Purbright would prefer. He himself stood for a moment, gazing at the place where the basket had been, noting the imprint on the black grit of the coal dust. There were two sets of marks, the weave of the basket and the sharper, parallel ridges left by something dragged across the ground. A suitcase, perhaps, or a box with iron corners. "Sergeant," Purbright said, "what time do the afternoon goods wagons leave this yard?" 2:45, sir," Love answered promptly. "And what time was this basket found?" 3:10. So either it missed its train or it was never meant to catch one. They walked back slowly, Love frowning in the way that indicated not frustration, but careful arrangement of facts. "Suppose, sir, that someone wished the town to believe Mrs. Clee had been murdered. The blood is planted, the scream prepared, the note left for her. Then where is she really?" Purbright gave him a small smile. "Ah, Sergeant, the perennial question. Where are the people of Flaxborough when they are not where they should be? Usually at the pub." By the time they returned to the market hall, the gossip had swollen like yeast. It was no longer merely that screams had been heard from a coffin or that Mrs. Clee had vanished. Now there were versions. In one, she had eloped with a traveling organist. In another, she had been seized by foreign agents disguised as choir boys. The more imaginative believed she had staged her own death to avoid a bill for cabbages. The mayor, cornered by 3 matrons and a justice of the peace, was muttering about decorum and scandal. Councillor Babble-Smith was crimson, insisting that his wife's name be kept entirely apart from proceedings, which ensured it was repeated more than anyone else's. Mr. Clegg stood like a monument of undertakerly composure, though his eyes flicked often to his assistant as if checking that youth had not betrayed them all by accident. Purbright mounted the dais, politely removing the mayor from his own platform. He let the room quieten, though it took a few minutes and the cough of someone whose conscience needed relief. "We have," he began. "A coffin that screamed though it contained nothing. We have a message written with lipstick announcing life in the very place where death is most expected. We have Mrs. Clee, absent, and we have, by the station, a basket stained with blood. These things may or may not belong together, but until we know, we shall assume they do." There was a murmur at that, as if the crowd had hoped for the comfort of separation. Purbright continued, "It may interest you to learn that the coffin's screams were not a woman's, but a machine's. Cleverly contrived, timed to cause the alarm we all experienced. The basket of blood may be the same, a contrivance, not the thing itself. We must therefore ask, not what happened, but who wishes us to believe that something has happened." The mayor tried to applaud this philosophy, but his hands faltered when no one joined. Purbright's gaze rested briefly on Dora Liversedge, who stood in her fox fur like a sentinel of scandal. Then on Mr. Clegg, stiff and grave. Then finally on Councillor Babel Smith, perspiring into his collar. "Until Mrs. Clee is found," he said, "we must suppose she may yet walk into the hall, offended at the fuss. If she does, I suggest you welcome her warmly. She may have much to explain." The crowd, unsatisfied but held in check by Purbright's calm, dispersed into smaller knots again. Love leaned near his inspector. "You mean to keep them dangling, sir?" "Dangling," said Purbright kindly, "is the safest state for a crowd. They cannot pull at anything if both hands are engaged in speculation." That evening, back in his office, Purbright sat with the letter addressed to Mrs. Clee spread upon the desk. He read it again and again, weighing its phrasing. "What the town has owed you for 11 years. Keep to the plan. Do not cry early." The words suggested conspiracy, but also the delicate vanity of someone who considered themselves a playwright. The mention of 11 years struck him most. What in Flaxborough had happened 11 years ago? Love, across the desk, was leafing through a stack of old council minutes, muttering dates. "There was a refurbishment of the market hall 11 years back, sir. A row about funding. Mrs. Clee provided catering for the opening gala, if you recall. There was talk she overcharged." "Overcharging," Purbright mused, "is one of the more unforgivable sins here, but hardly one to warrant revenge so elaborate." "Unless," Love suggested, "money was not all that changed hands." Purbright allowed the thought to linger, but did not endorse it. He closed the letter and placed it back in its envelope. Later that night, Flaxborough police received a telephone call. The voice was female, strained, and came over the line with the crackle of a kiosk exposed to wind. "Inspector Purbright?" it asked. Purbright, summoned from his chair, took the receiver himself. "Yes." There was a pause. Then, "She isn't dead." "But she will be if you don't listen. Tell them it was meant to be a rehearsal, nothing more. But now it's gone too far." "Who is this?" The line went dead. Love, who had caught only the end, asked sharply, "Mrs. Clee?" Purbright replaced the receiver slowly. "Perhaps, or perhaps, someone who wishes us to think so. It seems Flaxborough has rehearsals not only in the Dramatic Society, but in life." The next morning, Purbright called on Daphne Babel Smith at her drapery shop. She received him in the upstairs office, amid bolts of cloth and a typewriter that looked bullied. She was an imposing woman, with hair lacquered to permanence and a smile that managed to flatter and defy simultaneously. "Inspector," she said, with the air of welcoming a tradesman, "I hope you don't imagine I read every word of every form I signed for my husband's council schemes. The coffin? A detail, a flourish. Culture must be dressed, must it not?" Purbright inclined his head. "You wrote your name to an order for a coffin whose lock could be worked from the inside. Was that flourish too?" She waved a hand. "I assume the undertaker knows his business. Locks, latches, satin. I sign to make things happen. I'm not a mechanic." "Nor a dramatist?" Her eyes flickered. "I acted once long ago. A summer company in Scarborough. But one outgrows such things. Flaxborough has no stage worthy of me now. Yet it has had a performance, said Purbright mildly. One with screaming, blood, and vanishing ladies. Her smile froze. Inspector, if you suggest I staged such grotesquerie, you are mistaken. I prefer my scandals with better lighting. Then perhaps, Purbright said, you will not object if I speak instead to Mrs. Liversedge, or to the Dramatic Society, or to the butcher whose pig may have supplied the blood. Speak to whom you wish, she said crisply, but you will find the town owes me more than it owes Mrs. Clee. When he left, Purbright stood on the pavement outside the drapery and looked at the shop's gold oval sign. A lady with a hat box passed him, laughing too loudly. For an instant, he thought he saw Mrs. Clee's profile beneath the veil, but when he turned, she was gone into the crowd. Love joined him, breathless from a separate errand. "Sir," he said, "news from the railway clerk. A ticket was sold yesterday to London, single fare in the name of Birch. Female passenger, blonde. She boarded, but her seat was never occupied after Peterborough." Purbright looked down the street where the crowd had swallowed the laughing woman. "Then our rehearsal," he murmured, "may have opened on a different stage altogether." And as the church clock tolled the hour, the town of Flaxborough, still buzzing with rumour, did not know whether it had witnessed tragedy, comedy, or merely the first act of something waiting in the wings. Inspector Purbright was not the sort of man who hurried breakfast. The following morning he appeared at the station precisely at 8:30, unhurried, as if the night's mysteries had left him perfectly able to sleep, shave, and butter toast without agitation. Sergeant Love, however, arrived with a stack of papers under his arm and the faint pallor of one who had spent the night half in thought and half in restless turning. "Morning, sir," Love said, with an eagerness that suggested he had already rehearsed a dozen theories. "The blood from the basket, it's pig, as you suspected. Mr. Hornbeam, the butcher, confirms he lost a pail of offcuts yesterday, though he swears it vanished from outside his back door rather than being stolen. Then we must accept that pork, unlike most other livestock, sometimes walks away by itself," Purbright replied gently, adjusting his chair. "The question is, who would wish to set a stage with animal blood in the role of human? That narrows the cast to those with a flair for theatre." Love placed his notes on the desk. "And the telephone call? It could only have been Mrs. Clee. Who else would know of a rehearsal, and why else beg us to see it as no more than that?" Purbright folded his hands. "If it were Mrs. Clee, she has an odd way of soliciting rescue. A kiosk call, then silence. She wishes us to know she's alive, yet not to find her too quickly. That is not distress, it is direction." Before Love could press further, Constable Thacker tapped at the door and entered with a face that hovered between excitement and anxiety. "Sir, message from the post office. There's been another letter, this time addressed to you directly." He handed over a black-edged envelope, its handwriting identical to the one previously given to Mrs. Clee. Purbright slit it open with the indifference of a man opening a council-rate demand. Inside was a single card, also bordered in black, with a line written in crimson lipstick rather than ink. Interval. "Do not leave your seats." Love frowned. "They mean to continue, sir. Like a play." "Quite," said Purbright, turning the card over. "And this interval is intended to hold the audience together until the next act. A theatre of gossip, Sergeant, in which the whole town is both cast and crowd." It was then that Thacker, whose natural instinct was always to blurt, added, "And, sir, there's talk in the market already that Mrs. Liversedge's fox fur was found snagged on the coal yard fence. Some say it proves she carried the basket." "Does it?" Purbright asked mildly. "Foxes are known for slyness, not housekeeping. I dare say fur is prone to wander." Still, it was worth a visit. They found Dora Liversedge at her home, a narrow terraced house whose curtains looked as though they had been yanked shut against daylight's insolence. She opened the door with an expression that conceded nothing. "You've come about Beryl, I suppose," she said, before either man could speak. "Well, she's probably alive and louder than ever. People like her don't go quiet." Purbright inclined his head politely. "Your fox collar, Mrs. Liversedge. It was seen yesterday, very near the coffin, and again near the coal yard. Might we ask how it travels?" Dora laughed, a short, brittle sound. "If my collar has taken to wandering, it's because I've been dragged everywhere myself. Beryl's been chasing my husband these months past. He's not worth a turnip, but she's always had a taste for what isn't hers. If there's trouble now, you'll find her behind it, not me." Love, stiffly. "Are you suggesting she staged her own disappearance?" Dora's eyes narrowed. "I'm saying she would. Beryl lived for attention. If she could make the whole town think she was dead and then come back waving her purse, she'd do it for the clapping." Purbright's gaze rested on her gloves, which were thick, immaculate, and slightly powdered. "You wear them always, Mrs. Liversedge?" "I've reason," she said curtly. "Skin trouble. What business is it of yours? Only that lipstick, gloves, and wintergreen all make for theatrical props, and you strike me as a lady not unwilling to play a part." For a second, her eyes betrayed a flash of alarm, quickly hidden beneath contempt. "Find Beryl before you make accusations. I've got washing." And she closed the door with finality. Back at the station, Love was bristling. "She knows more than she'll admit, sir. The fox fur, the bitterness about her husband. She had every reason to see Mrs. Clee disgraced." "And yet," said Purbright, "her performance is too eager. Guilt hides, envy parades. We must be wary of mistaking noise for evidence." He drew from his drawer the first letter to Mrs. Clee and laid it beside the new card. 11 years, Sergeant. That detail itches. What was the town's quarrel with Mrs. Clee 11 years ago? Love consulted the council minutes again. "The flower show, sir. That year she took over the catering contract from the Women's Institute. There was a scandal. Claims she had replaced homemade cakes with bought ones. Mrs. Prowse still refers to it as the Great Sponge Affair." Purbright allowed the faintest smile. "And Flaxborough remembers grievances long after it forgets marriages. Suppose someone believes that Mrs. Clee's reputation has never been properly punished. A false death, a screaming coffin, blood in baskets, all contrived to paint her as a fraud or victim, either way a spectacle." Love leaned forward. "But to what end?" "Endings, Sergeant, are for plays. In Flaxborough we must content ourselves with motives, envy, revenge, or simply the satisfaction of spectacle. That afternoon, a fresh stir arose when news came that Mrs. Clee's handbag, empty of money but stuffed with torn theatre programs, had been found beneath a bench at the Riverside Park. The programs were from the Flaxborough Dramatic Society, dated some years back. Each bore lipstick marks over the faces of leading ladies. "It ties her to the theatre crowd," Love muttered. "Or someone wants us to think it does." Purbright studied the papers with mild interest. "The Dramatic Society rehearses tonight, I believe. We shall attend. Nothing attracts confession like an audience." The rehearsal hall was musty with curtains, varnished chairs, and the fragrance of theatrical dust. On stage, a cluster of earnest amateurs were stumbling through a scene from Arsenic and Old Lace. The line, "I'm not dead yet," rang out with comic incongruity, and for a moment Purbright and Love exchanged glances. The Society's chairwoman, Mrs. Daphne Babel-Smith, presided with her fox-like smile, clipboard in hand. She greeted the policeman with theatrical delight. "Inspector, Sergeant, do join our rehearsal. We thrive on drama in every form." Purbright bowed slightly. "We are here merely to observe, though your choice of play is, if I may say so, remarkably apt." The actors tittered uneasily. During a break, Purbright wandered among the props. He found on a side table a roll of tape, identical to that used on the screaming machine, and a battered alarm clock missing its bell. He lifted them gently. "Stage property?" Mrs. Babel-Smith laughed, though not comfortably. "Old stock, Inspector." We never throw anything out." "Not even old grievances?" Purbright asked, his voice mild but penetrating. Her eyes cooled. "Grievances, Inspector, are the lifeblood of theatre, but we save them for the stage." It was then that a shout came from backstage. A young actress, pale and trembling, had discovered something in a wardrobe of costumes. They hurried over to find, folded among cloaks and wigs, a bundle of white satin, the very lining of a coffin, stitched clumsily by hand and stained faintly with wintergreen. Love's jaw tightened. "This proves it, sir. The society's behind it all." Purbright touched the satin, noting the hasty needlework, the smudges of lipstick on the folds. He did not speak immediately, only turned to look at the group of actors who stood in guilty silence. At last he said, "This is not proof of guilt, it is proof of props, and props do not play themselves. Someone here, or someone with access, has taken your hobby for their stage. The question is, was it done to humiliate Mrs. Clee, or to protect her?" Mrs. Babel Smith lifted her chin. "You cannot seriously suggest that an amateur society would kidnap a woman." "No," Purbright said very quietly. "But I can suggest that a woman who wished to disappear for a while might find here the friends or enemies willing to supply the costumes." When they left, Love could barely contain himself. "Sir, this is getting out of hand. We've satin linings, lipstick messages, blood baskets, screaming machines, and all point back to Mrs. Clee herself. What if she planned it all?" Purbright walked slowly beneath the street lamps, his hat tipped against the drizzle. "Then, Sergeant, we must ask what she hoped to gain by casting herself dead. Insurance? Sympathy? Or perhaps, as Mrs. Liversedge said, applause." He paused at the corner and looked down the dark street where the river gleamed faintly. "But plays have climaxes, Sergeant. This one has not reached it yet, and when it does, we shall learn whether Mrs. Clee is the playwright or the prop." And with that, they walked back into the night of Flaxborough, where windows glowed with gossip and every curtain seemed ready to rise on the next act. The next day opened with an air of anticipation, as though the town itself, restless from the interval, was waiting for the curtain to rise again. Shopkeepers leaned out of doorways to exchange theories. Milkmen lingered to deliver speculation along with bottles, and in the station buffet, where Mrs. Clee ought to have presided, people ordered tea as if by doing so they might summon her back. Inspector Purbright, however, did not appear eager to provide them with an encore. He spent the morning not at the market hall nor the police station, but in quiet perambulation, calling on various corners of Flaxborough where memory was stored more reliably than in people's mouths. He visited the records office, the parish registers, and even the Yellow Lion public house, whose landlord remembered debts far longer than he remembered drinks. Sergeant Love followed him, puzzled but loyal, scribbling notes whenever the inspector paused to ask some innocuous-seeming question. At last, as the church clock struck 11, Purbright stopped in the shade of the town war memorial and leaned upon the rail. "Sergeant," he said mildly, "what do you recall of the Dramatic Society's production 11 years ago, the one that coincided with Mrs. Clee's quarrel with the Women's Institute?" Love frowned. "A comedy, wasn't it? Something about mistaken identities and corpses in cupboards. I was still in uniform then. The society sold tickets at the flower show." "Why?" "Because," Purbright replied, "that was the same summer Mrs. Clee secured her catering monopoly. The same summer there was a quarrel over missing funds from the raffle, and the same summer, if parish records are to be trusted, that one of our current suspects was quietly forced from a committee post. I suspect our drama today is not fresh invention at all, but a revival." Love stared at him. "A revenge, you mean, after 11 years?" "Flaxborough," said Purbright gently, "is a place where time improves grudges the way cellars improve port." Their speculations were interrupted by Thacker arriving at a trot, clutching his helmet lest it bounce off. "Sir, message from the vicar's wife," Something's happened at St. Swithin's crypt. She says you're to come at once." St. Swithin's lay squat and respectable at the end of the high street, its churchyard dotted with leaning stones that seemed to listen in on the gossip of sparrows. Inside, the air was damp and cool, the smell of stone dust and old hymns. Mrs. Prowse, pale with agitation, met them at the vestry door. "I am sorry to disturb you, Inspector, but the sexton was preparing the crypt for cleaning and discovered—" "Well, you had better see." They descended narrow steps into the gloom where a single bulb swayed faintly from its cord. There, upon a bier used long ago for parish ceremonies, lay a coffin, not Clegg's polished Victorian example, but a rougher wooden box, lid propped open. Inside, to the shock of all but Purbright, lay Mrs. Beryl Clee. She was not dead. Indeed, she sat upright against the satin padding, cheeks flushed, eyes blazing with indignation. "About time," she snapped. "I've been waiting hours. No one even thought to bring a flask." Love's exclamation of relief choked itself into astonishment. "Mrs. Clee, you're alive." "Of course I'm alive. I told them it was a rehearsal. I agreed to play my part, but I never agreed to be locked down here like laundry, and without breakfast." Purbright regarded her with the mild curiosity one might bestow upon a wasp nest discovered behind a clock. "You say you agreed, madam. To whom did you agree?" "To the society, of course. Mrs. Babel Smith asked me, said it would give the flower show some atmosphere. Artistic flair, she called it. A scream here, a disappearance there, all very dramatic. I was to vanish for a day and then reappear to shock them all. But someone's gone and stretched it too far." "Stretched it how?" Purbright asked. She dabbed at her hair with a dignity quite undimmed by her surroundings. "They took my bag. They planted that blood. And they locked me in here overnight without so much as a sandwich. That was not part of the bargain." Love pressed. "Did you see who locked you in?" "I saw nothing. They said to wait here until the inspector came to fetch me. I thought it part of the play, but by morning I realized no one was coming. If this is art, they can keep it." Purbright studied her calmly. "So you entered the crypt willingly, expecting to be released, and someone chose otherwise. Very well. Let us get you into daylight before the town buries you properly." Word traveled faster than Purbright could escort her back. By the time they emerged into the high street, a crowd had formed, half cheering, half disappointed. "She's alive!" someone shouted. "I told you it was all a sham," another retorted. And still others muttered darkly about hoaxes, money, and wasted time. Mrs. Clee marched in front, handbag clutched like a scepter. "I'll have something to say about this," she declared. "Nobody makes a fool of Beryl Clee and gets away with it." Back at the police station, once tea had been administered, Purbright questioned her gently. Bit by bit, her story emerged. She admitted she had been approached by Daphne Babel Smith and 2 other members of the Dramatic Society with the idea of a staged disappearance. They assured her it was harmless fun, designed to liven the show and draw visitors. She was flattered, who wouldn't be, and agreed to perform the scream from the coffin using a recording contraption provided by one of the younger actors. She was to leave the buffet, deposit her bag with ticket inside, and vanish for a day before reappearing. "But I never wrote any lipstick message," she insisted hotly, "and I never agreed to pig's blood. That was somebody else's embroidery, and as for shutting me in the crypt, well, I'll see them in court." Purbright listened without interruption, only occasionally nodding. When she had exhausted her indignation, he said, "So you lent yourself to a hoax, Mrs. Clee, but discovered too late that the hoax had turned against you. Whoever wished to frighten this town used your vanity as their lever. The question remains, who benefited by keeping you underground?" Her eyes flashed. "Dora Liversedge, of course. She's never forgiven me for being more popular at the station buffet than she is at home, and she has the fox fur to prove it." Love muttered agreement, but Purbright raised a hand. "Accusations are easy, Mrs. Clee. Truth is more difficult. For now, you will remain here under police care until we decide whether you are victim, conspirator, or both." Mrs. Clee drew herself up, affronted. "I am the injured party, and I'll have the town know it." Purbright's mild smile suggested that the town already did. That evening, as the lamps lit the market square, Purbright walked alone beneath the drizzle, reflecting. The play had revealed its leading lady, alive and indignant, but the mystery of who had extended the drama from farce to menace remained. The next act came sooner than expected. Shortly after 9, a messenger boy arrived breathless at the station with yet another black-edged envelope. This one bore no name, only the words, "For curtain call." Inside was a sheet torn from a dramatic society program, on which was scrawled in lipstick, "She has spoken too soon. Close the lid." Love slammed his hand on the desk. "A threat. They mean to silence her now that she's talked." Purbright laid the note flat. "Or they mean us to believe so. Either way, we must attend the society's rehearsal again tonight. Curtains fall where actors gather." The rehearsal hall was half in darkness when they arrived. On stage, 2 members rehearsed a quarrel, their voices echoing. But backstage, in the wings, Purbright found something far more telling. The same tape recorder, rewound and ready, with a fresh spool labeled in neat capitals, "Try 3 to scream louder." And beside it, tucked carelessly among costumes, was a fox fur collar with a strand of satin clinging to its hook. Purbright looked at the objects a long while. Then, turning to Love, he said quietly, "Our culprit is refining the performance. The first scream was rehearsal. The second was meant to be a premiere. And now they are rehearsing again, for a finale." Love asked, half in dread, "A finale for whom, sir?" Purbright's eyes softened as though addressing the air. "For Mrs. Clee, or for Flaxborough itself, whichever draws the louder applause." Outside, the drizzle thickened into rain. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the half-hour, and in the hall behind them, the dramatic society rehearsed lines about murder with nervous laughter, while above the stage someone had already hung a black curtain ready to fall. Purbright tilted his hat against the rain and murmured, almost to himself, "The play has begun to write its own ending. We must be ready when it demands the last act." Sergeant Love remained glowering at the fox fur while Purbright let his gaze travel, slow as rain, across a window, from wing to wing. He looked not so much for objects as for the behavior of objects. The way a coil of cable had been put down as if in apology, a prop chair left square to the stage when the rest had been angled, a smear of wintergreen on a velvet drape where it did not belong. Then he said, lightly as if asking for the time, "Sergeant, would you be so good as to post Constable Thacker by the alley at the back and ask Mr. Clegg where his van is? I should like, for once, to be early to our next surprise." Clegg's van, black, modest, and more punctilious about its polish than most brides, was not where Clegg had left it. Huggins, face blotched with effort, asserted that he had moved it "just a foot or two, sir," to let the dramatic society bring in their scenery. A door frame and a fake fireplace that had once served in 3 comedies and a tragic romance. Then, he said, he had gone to fetch petrol from the yard by the gasworks, and, when he came back, the van was gone. "But it can't have gone far because I've got the keys." He produced them with the heartfelt pride of a man saving himself from drowning by brandishing the plug of the bath. "Indeed," Purbright murmured, as if discussing the weather. "Keys are a more democratic invention than they used to be." He turned his head a fraction, listening not to the hall, but to the town beyond, to the texture of its noise. Flaxborough at night had distinct layers. The late bus cursing its schedule, the publican's laugh dripping from a doorway, the hiss of the river, the clatter of a bicycle that had just discovered gravel. Among these, faint and quick, came the small, decisive cough of a motor starting without announcing itself. They followed it with the patience of cats. The cough led through the ginnel beside the ironmongers, along the cobbles behind the haberdasher, where thread and truth were both stretched, and out into the lane by the wharf. There the van waited, close into the wall with the diffidence of a respectable man at a scandal. Its lamps were dark, its bodywork reflected only the river's dull shine. Purbright put a hand to the side panel. It was warm, and the warmth had a pulse to it, a tremor that was not mechanical. Love, bent to the door, heard it a second later, a muffled cry. It had that particular pitch that belongs to voices trying not to be believed. He looked to his inspector and found no alarm there, only a kind of courtesy, as if they were about to interrupt someone's private rehearsal. "Your keys, Mr. Huggins," Purbright said. Huggins's hands fumbled. The key bit thrice before it behaved. The rear doors opened with a reluctance that might have been discretion. Inside, amid the tidy apparatus of a tradesman who dealt daily with sorrow, lay a coffin, the Society's rough one, not Clegg's museum piece, its lid shut and its rope handles arranged as if for a demonstration. The faint cry became a flurry, and then the thud-thud of someone's hands, trying to be conversation. "Now then," said Purbright in the voice one uses to horses. "We are here." The screws on this lid had not been set with undertakerly love. They yielded to Love's impatience and Mr. Elgin's borrowed screwdriver. The lid swung up, banged the van's ceiling, and from the white gloom of the lining, Dora Liversedge rose like indignation, finding air. Her fox collar was skewed, her gloves were still immaculate. On the gag hastily knotted about her mouth, somebody's neckerchief. There was a sharp smell of wintergreen. Her eyes, when they found Purbright, were not grateful. They were furious. "You again," she said when the gag was removed, and swallowed the wintergreen with a cough. "This town has taken to stuffing me into boxes. I don't know what arrangement you have with Mrs. Clee, Inspector, but if it involves me, you may count me out." Love, half indignation and half relief, demanded who had done this to her. "A man with manners," Dora said tartly. "Which narrows it. He asked me to step into the alley, said Mrs. Babel Smith wanted a quiet word about costumes. Next thing I find myself in the back of this black cupboard being lectured about silence. And then the lid. The whole town has taken leave of its senses." She rubbed at her mouth with a gloved knuckle and looked at the glove as if it had disappointed her. There was a smear on the leather, the color of theatre lipstick. Purbright glanced within the van. On a crate beside the coffin sat the hat-box apparatus, newly wired. The alarm clock trembled, its minute hand 4 shy of the half-hour. A spool on the recorder bore a crisp label. "Try 3. Scream louder," written in a hand that made even enthusiasm tidy. Beside it lay a folded sheet torn from the Dramatic Society's prompt copy. On the blank reverse, someone had written with a lipstick that skated when pressed. "No intermission." "Refinement," Purbright murmured. "Our impresario intends to improve with practice." His eye went to the inside of the van door, where the wood had been scuffed by someone's heel in a deliberate rhythm. 3 quick, 2 slow, 3 quick again. "Mrs. Liversedge," he said as if asking after her health, "do you tap your foot so?" She followed his gaze, frowned, and shook her head. "Not unless there's music. There was nothing to dance to in there but my temper." Love lifted the hat box with the careful disgust one reserves for deceit. "Whoever did this meant us to find it, sir. They meant a second performance." "They meant an audience," said Purbright. He looked at Dora, who was discovering, to her own surprise, that after fear, indignation returns like appetite. "Can you name your courteous abductor?" Dora opened her mouth to say Huggins, closed it again, and considered. "Voice like a young man pretending to be older," she said. Words chosen as if he were paying for them, the kind that calls women madam in a way that makes you want to wash. She stared at Huggins, who blushed with such thoroughness that it could be innocence performing guilt or guilt performing innocence. "He says nothing like anybody," Dora added, almost disappointed. "Thank you," Purbright said, as if for a donation. He turned to Huggins. "Where did you go for your petrol, Mr. Huggins?" "Back of the gasworks, sir," Huggins stammered. "Mr. Smeaton keeps a drum for emergencies. He weren't there. I helped myself and left a chit." "Then we must hope Mr. Smeaton is as understanding as his accounts," Purbright said. "Sergeant, would you and Constable Thacker be so good as to escort Mrs. Liversedge home by streets that happen to pass 3 pubs? Let the town see her upright. It will do them more good than any sermon." Dora, who privately liked the idea of being seen to have survived, allowed herself to be handed down with a dignity that accepted triumph as the moral of danger. As she went, she paused and looked back into the van. "Tell your dramatists," she said to the air, "that if they wish to use me again, they will pay, and I don't mean in programs." When they had gone, Purbright remained a while with the van. He closed the coffin lid but did not screw it down. He turned the alarm clock's little brass wheel a fraction backward and watched the hand sag with disappointment. He touched the lipstick note with a pencil, and it obeyed by leaving a little red on the wood. Then he sniffed the air again and found, in addition to wintergreen, a faint, expensive sharpness, the kind of scent that announces itself only to the ambitious. He said nothing of it. He was listening again to the town's noise. Back at the hall, the discovery proceeded along the quickest arteries: buffet, bar, barber shop. By the time Purbright and Huggins returned, the mayor had prepared a small speech about moral panic and was thwarted in the delivery by people preferring the details. Mrs. Babel Smith stood very still near the footlights, her clipboard held close, her smile set at the angle people reserve for portraits. When Purbright approached, she greeted him with the calm of a person who has rehearsed encounters and never yet forgotten her lines. "Inspector," she said, "you bring the sunshine with you. I trust you have found our town wild with gratitude." "Wild," said Purbright amiably, "is a word Flaxborough prefers when describing hedges. Today it has gone further. Mrs. Liversedge has been removed from a van. She says she was invited by a voice to discuss costumes." "Does she?" Mrs. Babel Smith allowed herself no wrinkle. "Then pray assure her that my discussions are never in alleys." Purbright inclined his head. "I shall. This, however, you may assure me. The Fox Furback stage? Yours?" "Good heavens, no." The little laugh she provided had no oxygen in it. "I do not borrow from the wives of casual labor. If it was there because someone wished us to find it." "Quite," said Purbright. "One observes, from time to time, that props arrive on stage at the moment most helpful to the plot." She looked past him then, and for the first time there was a flicker, a little jump of the eye, towards the wings where, Purbright had already noticed, a bolt of Daphne's shop ribbon held a drape. Gold oval, stamped ribbon. A small thing, absurd to keep and yet kept, as guilty people keep the advertisements of their own involvement. Sergeant Love returned from his escorting with a report polished by walk and retold gossip. Dora, it seemed, had made of her rescue a promenade. Men raised their hats, women compared notes. A child solemnly asked if she had been dead, and, if so, had she seen the Queen. Love added in a lower voice that Mrs. Clee, kept at the station for her own safety and the town's, had asked for a comb, a ham sandwich, and the loan of a mirror. She says she will give a statement this evening to set the record right. "Records in Flaxborough," Purbright said, "are accustomed to being set right every 8 hours. We shall hear her at the station and with the door open. The town will otherwise furnish its own statement." A messenger from the post office, bulging with duty, arrived with yet another envelope edged in mourning. Purbright opened it where he stood, not because he expected shock, but because he had acquired a taste for the sender's style. The card inside was cut from a program and bore a single line in that same vigorous lipstick. "Act 2 begins when the clock is put right." He let it lie in his palm a moment. "Clocks," he said mildly to Love, have been everywhere with us. The taped alarm, the van's little brass wheel sulking, the town's appetite for the hour's news. Someone thinks himself a stage manager. And who put the hall clock wrong? Love asked, looking up at the dial over the dais, which had chosen to be 20 minutes brave of the truth since the refurbishment 11 years ago. Who indeed? Murmured Purbright. It was said at the time that the new clock ran fast because Mrs. Clee wished to sell more tea in the interval. Love began to smile, and then stopped short of certainty. You think she? I think, said Purbright, that an old joke has been conscripted into a new malice, and that someone who remembers such jokes is running his play by them. The second incident had done what second incidents must. It had moved suspicion as a stagehand moves flats, so that what had been background scuttled forward and the obvious took one pace back. Dora Liversedge had changed parts from suspect to victim with the efficiency of a quick-change artist. The dramatic society had acquired, along with its satin, a motive either to boast or to hide. Clegg's business had given a vehicle to an outrage, and Mrs. Clee, alive and fortifying herself with ham, had become a public asset in danger of depreciation. In the late light, when the high street was all reflected windows and rehearsed smiles, Purbright walked alone as far as the river and back, and the town consulted itself about him. People who had never wanted theatre now wished for tickets. Those who liked a good death complained they were being palmed off with a farce. Righteous men rehearsed moral conclusions. Guilty ones rehearsed alibis like hymns. At the station, Mrs. Clee demanded more pickle. At the drapery, ribbon was cut with tidy savagery. In the yard behind the hall, someone practiced saying madam in 3 politenesses and 4 threats. When Purbright at last sat in his office and poured himself the kind of tea that forgives nothing, he laid out on the blotter the little cards and slips the town had sent him. No flowers. The sandwiches will suffice. Interval, do not leave your seats. For curtain call. She has spoken too soon. Close the lid. And now, Act 2 begins when the clock is put right. He placed the order for the coffin among them like an elderly relative at a wedding photograph. He arranged them not by time, but by intention, the way one orders people at a dinner one hopes will end in honesty. Then he did something which in another man might have looked like prayer. He closed his eyes and listened for the town's breathing. When he opened them, he wrote a note for Sergeant Love. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. The market hall clock to be corrected in the presence of all concerned. Invite. Mrs. Clee, Mr. and Mrs. Babel Smith, Mr. Clegg and Mr. Huggins, Mrs. Liversedge, Gedge, Mrs. Prowse, Dramatic Society Committee. And ask the mayor to bring his rosette pin. He did not explain the pin. He did not explain the clock. He did not, even to himself, explain why the word ode from that first letter kept threading itself through all the rest like a red stitch. He only knew that the town's play wanted an audience for its next scene, and that, if he could arrange the stage kindly, the guilty would do the remainder of the work. The morning of Purbright's gathering was one of those Flaxborough mornings that seemed to have been designed not by nature, but by the borough council, grey, damp, and faintly municipal. The market hall clock, its hands proudly 20 minutes fast, as they had been for 11 years, looked down at the square like a teacher certain her pupils would misbehave the moment she turned her back. By 10 o'clock, the inspector had assembled his cast. They arrived not with the eagerness of citizens, but with the reluctance of actors who suspect the play has too few lines and too many critics. Mrs. Beryl Clee entered first, handbag clamped to her side like a child dragged to church. She had taken pains with her appearance, as though daring the town to remark that confinement in a crypt was bad for the complexion. "I hope," she announced at once, "that there will be tea after this. And scones. It is an outrage to drag a woman out at this hour without refreshment." The mayor bustled in, rosette polished, eager to be seen. Councillor Babel Smith followed with the air of a man whose wife was about to outshine him yet again. Daphne herself swept in behind. Fox smiled and stiff-backed, her drapery shop's perfume clinging about her like a stage curtain. Mr. Clegg, solemn as a judge, arrived with Huggins trailing, his suit brushed but his moustache uncertain. Mrs. Dora Liversedge came last, collar proud, gloves faultless, expression daring anyone to imagine she had screamed in a coffin for free. The Dramatic Society's committee drifted in like extras, hoping for credit, whispering, adjusting spectacles, waiting to see whether they would be asked to confess or merely clap. Sergeant Love and Constable Thacker stood by the dais, the former immaculate, the latter creased with earnestness. At the center of it all, Purbright stood like a conductor whose orchestra had not yet realized it was tuning up. "Thank you," he said mildly, "for giving me your time. Flaxborough, as you know, has been both entertained and disturbed these last days by a performance involving coffins, blood, screams, and vanishing ladies. We now come, as the notes tell us, to Act 2, and Act 2 cannot begin until the clock is put right." He gestured toward the market hall clock. A council workman on a ladder, blinking at the crowd, fidgeted with its hands. As he moved them backward, the long-standing fastness of 20 minutes was corrected, and for the first time in over a decade, the clock agreed with the church tower opposite. A ripple went through the gathering. People shifted uneasily, as though the universe had lost a familiar limp. "It was said," Purbright continued, "that the clock ran fast because Mrs. Clee wished longer intervals for her teas and sandwiches. Some laughed at the joke, others stored it as grievance. 11 years later, that joke has been resurrected. We have had screaming machines, baskets of pig blood, lipstick messages, crypt confinements, all contrived to make the town relive the scandal of what it thought it was owed. The question is, who required us to watch this revival?" Mrs. Clee snapped open her handbag as though applause might be inside. "If you ask me, Inspector, it's Mrs. Liversedge. She's envied my popularity for years. She'd love nothing better than to see me humbled." "Rubbish!" Dora's voice cracked like a whip. "It's you, Beryl. You always loved attention. If you weren't stuffing people with sandwiches, you were stuffing yourself into plays. You screamed for fun, and now you're screaming for sympathy." Daphne Babel-Smith gave her little oxygenless laugh. "Ladies, really. The inspector means to suggest a villain. Flaxborough has few enough, though it does have many dramatists." Purbright raised a hand. "Let us leave accusations for a moment. Consider instead the props. The screaming device was made of tape, clock, and lipstick. The coffin ordered with latch inside. The blood planted. The cards written. Each piece bears the style of a person who thinks theatrically, who believes townsfolk and audience to be entertained. Not a murderer, but a producer." His eyes moved over them, settling neither too long nor too little on any. Mrs. Clee agreed to play her part. Yes, but someone else wrote the play. That someone confined her longer than she consented, staged a second kidnapping, and sent us notes of direction. Who, then, among you thinks of life in scenes and acts? The Dramatic Society committee shuffled uneasily. Their chairwoman straightened. "Inspector, you cannot mean us. We indulge in amateur theatricals, nothing more. You insult us if you suggest we would endanger life." "Life has not been endangered," Purbright said. "Only reputation, which in Flaxborough is more delicate." "But insult?" "No, madam. I suggest only that your stage provided convenient property for another's drama. For example." He nodded at the fox fur collar produced by Love from evidence. "Left backstage. Who left it? Not Mrs. Liversedge, who values it too dearly. Someone who wanted suspicion to fall upon her." Dora glared triumphantly at Daphne. "You're doing—" Daphne did not flinch, but her smile acquired a crack. "Inspector, I do not borrow or steal accessories." "No," said Purbright, "but you do sign forms." "The coffin order bore your hand. You say you did not read it." "Perhaps not, but someone chose you to sign because they knew you would not." That person is close to you, Mrs. Babble-Smith, close enough to know your habit of lending your name where culture is concerned. She turned her head very slowly towards her husband. Councillor Babble-Smith gave a strangled laugh. Me? Good heavens, Inspector. I have no time for theatricals. My business is bylaws, not burlesque. Purbright's eyes softened as if sympathizing with a schoolboy caught. Councillor, you have long nursed grievance against Mrs. Clee. She supplanted your wife's WI friends in catering. She mocked you at meetings. She sells sandwiches dearer than your speeches. 11 years you have carried it, and now, with a little tape recorder and a little stagecraft borrowed from your wife's society, you saw a chance to repay the town's laughter. The mayor gasped. Babble-Smith, surely not. But the councillor, red to the ears, was already floundering. Absurd! I've never touched a lipstick in my life. Indeed, Purbright said gently, but you have touched a clock. Thacker saw you in the hall last week, adjusting the raffle stand. The very stand where the coffin lid with its message was later propped. On your handkerchief we found the smear of that same crimson grease. You thought it ink, no doubt. And you were overheard, councillor, by Ivy of the Oxfam stall. A voice like a young man pretending to be older, she said. Words chosen with care. Madam, you called her, inviting her into the alley, and then you locked her in the van. All eyes were upon him. Huggins shifted uneasily, realizing suspicion had shifted away from him at last. Dora let out a crow of vindicated delight. Daphne froze. Her smile stiffened into portraiture. Councillor Babble-Smith tried once more. If all you have is lipstick and clocks, you cannot... He was silenced by Purbright raising the mayor's rosette pin. And this, left embedded in the satin of the coffin lining, dropped in your eagerness to arrange the scene. The mayor does not lose his pins, but you borrowed his rosette the day before to show some new design. Small things, councillor, but small things accumulate, like grievances. A hush fell, broken only by Mrs. Clee's indignant snort. So it was him all along, making me look a fool, as if I'd need his help. Purbright inclined his head. He wished the town to laugh at you as it laughed at him, to be frightened, then relieved, then scornful. A play in 3 acts, but his actors were too lively. Mrs. Clee impatient, Mrs. Liversedge furious, the society careless. The drama collapsed under its own ambition. Love stepped forward. Councillor Basil Babble-Smith, I must ask you to accompany me. The councillor sagged, shoulders dropping, a man who had rehearsed denial but not surrender. It was only a jest, he muttered, only a jest the town owed me. Yes, said Purbright softly, and jests, like debts, can be collected too late. The assembly broke with the relief of villagers released from compulsory hymn-singing. Dora went off to display her triumph. Mrs. Clee demanded the promised tea. The dramatic society fluttered like hens avoiding the pot. Daphne walked out alone, smile frozen, dignity dragging behind her like an unwanted train. Purbright remained a while, gazing up at the market hall clock, now honest to the minute. Strange, he murmured to Love, how people prefer their clocks wrong if it suits their habits. Correct them and they grow uneasy. Much like truth. Love exhaled. So it's over, sir. Over? Purbright's smile was faint. No, Sergeant. Merely the interval's end. We must yet see how our players behave when the curtain falls for good. And with that, he turned back towards the station, where paperwork waited as patiently as ever, and where the town of Flaxborough, deprived of its play, was already beginning to invent new scenes of its own. By the next morning, the matter of Councillor Babble-Smith's arrest had already divided Flaxborough into 2 distinct camps, those who insisted they had always known him to be peculiar, and those who, out of sheer contrariness, declared him a misunderstood visionary. Both camps had one thing in common. Each claimed they had predicted this outcome from the very first scream in the coffin. At the police station, however, the mood was less self-congratulatory. Sergeant Love, although satisfied that the counsellor was in custody, could not quite rid himself of unease. He had spent half the night going over the evidence. Lipstick smears, rosette pin, fox fur, clock adjustments, and though the chain was neat, it felt, in his words, too well polished for Flaxborough. Purbright, seated at his desk with an expression of polite patience, stirred his tea before replying. "The town does not polish its scandals, Sergeant. It scuffs them like old shoes. When they gleam, it is because someone has made them so. That, perhaps, is where our eyes should linger." Love frowned. "You mean, sir, that someone arranged it so neatly we couldn't miss the trail?" "Exactly. A little too much lipstick, a little too obvious a rosette. It is not the counsellor's style. His vanity runs to bylaws, not melodrama. And what did we hear from his own lips? That it was meant only as a jest, a debt repaid. It sounded more like a line given to him than one he wrote himself." The sergeant leaned back, the unease deepening. "Then we've locked up the wrong man." Purbright lifted his gaze, mild as ever. "We have locked up a man who enjoyed thinking he was cleverer than he is. That is rarely a waste of police time. But whether he is the author or merely a fortunate understudy, that remains to be decided." Late that afternoon, Mrs. Beryl Clee arrived at the station in a state of indignation bordering on exultation. She carried a tray of sandwiches which she declared were for press representatives only, though none were present. Planting herself opposite Purbright, she announced, "Inspector, I'm prepared to give a full statement to the newspapers. I expect police protection while doing so, and preferably an escort when I next open the buffet. I will not have the public thinking I was a party to this farce. I am the injured woman here." Purbright's eyes twinkled, though his voice was gravely courteous. "Indeed, madam, and in your statement you will of course wish to include the names of those who persuaded you to join their rehearsal." Her mouth tightened. "I was misled, Inspector. Mrs. Babel Smith said it would be culture for the town. I've always supported culture." "Of course," Purbright murmured. "And the blood in the basket, was that part of culture also?" Mrs. Clee sniffed. "How should I know? I assumed it was stage paint. The Dramatic Society has barrels of the stuff." Love, watching, noted the twitch of her hand as she rearranged the sandwiches. Left over right, diagonally stacked, crusts aligned. It was the gesture of someone used to arranging things until they looked just so. When she left in a cloud of perfume and pastry, Purbright said quietly, "You see, Sergeant, too tidy. Too much of the hand that likes an audience. She may have been a victim, yes, but she has the temperament of a producer." That evening they visited Daphne Babel Smith at her drapery shop. She received them with brittle graciousness, as though police inquiry were another form of retail. The bolts of cloth leaned in the background like disapproving dowagers. "Inspector," she said, "if you wish to lecture me further about my husband's follies, I must remind you that I have customers. Flaxborough still requires its drapery, even if its councillors are disgraced." Purbright glanced around at the gold oval ribbons and immaculate displays. "Mrs. Babel Smith, it occurs to me that much of this business is presentation. One arranges cloths and ribbons for maximum effect, yes? Just as one arranges props and people. Do you suppose someone close to you has been arranging too much?" Her smile sharpened. "If you mean my husband, he was always eager to play a part greater than his abilities. If he has embarrassed himself, it is no surprise." "Embarrassment," Purbright said softly, "was the point. To humiliate Mrs. Clee, to draw the town into a spectacle, to reduce council respectability. Yet what interests me is that it was staged with a precision your husband has never shown in anything. He could not organize a raffle without misplacing the tickets, but someone else could. Someone who understands how much a town enjoys being both audience and actor." For the first time her eyes flickered, and the lacquered smile faltered. "Are you suggesting, Inspector, that I—" Purbright inclined his head as though declining tea. "I suggest nothing. I observe only that the person most skilled in theatre is rarely content to remain backstage." Back at the station, as the rain thudded against windows, Love laid out the pieces on the blotter. "So which is it, sir? The counsellor, the wife, or Mrs. Clee herself? Every clue seems to point a different way." "Or every clue points the same way," Purbright replied. "But someone keeps turning the signpost." "Look again. The coffin order, signed by Daphne. The lipstick, used by both women. The blood, handled by someone who knew the butcher's habits. The screams, recorded by a machine borrowed from the society. Each element points to a circle of people who all know one another too well." "And the motive?" Purbright sipped his tea. "The town owed something, or so our playwright believes. That phrase appears in the first letter. A debt of 11 years. What was owed? Not money. Flaxborough never pays debts in money if gossip will do. No, Sergeant, it was respect. Someone believed they were denied their proper applause." The following morning, as if summoned by thought, a new envelope arrived. It was not edged in black this time, but in gold. Inside, written in a large, confident hand, were the words, "Final dress rehearsal, tonight. All cast to be present." It was unsigned. Love muttered, "They mean the society rehearsal." Purbright smiled faintly. "Naturally, the time has come to bring down the curtain." That evening the rehearsal hall filled not only with the dramatic society, but with townsfolk unable to resist. The atmosphere was more pantomime than drama. People jostled, whispered, and craned to see. The mayor, relieved that the affair was nearing a climax, hovered pompously near the front. Mrs. Clee occupied a chair with her sandwiches beside her like a stall at market. Dora Liversedge glowered from another corner, fox fur gleaming. On stage, the society faltered through lines until Purbright raised his hand. The room stilled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "tonight's play is not arsenic and old lace. It is the drama that Flaxborough has itself provided these past days. You have seen screams from coffins, messages in lipstick, blood in baskets, women vanish and reappear. You have speculated, accused, applauded, and booed. But every play must end, and before the curtain falls, you deserve the truth." He paused, letting the silence spread like a tide. The counsellor was not our playwright. He enjoyed believing so, but he was only a puppet. The true hand behind the curtain was... The gasp came before he could name it. At the back of the hall, a figure had collapsed. Daphne Bubble-Smith, rigid in her chair, a folded program clutched in her gloved hand. Love and Thacker hurried to her, but she was not dead. She was trembling, eyes wide, mouth working soundlessly. In her lap, the program had been scrawled across with lipstick. "No more intervals. Curtain now." The hall erupted in chatter. Some cried out, others rushed forward. Purbright alone remained still, watching Daphne's face as though it were a mirror of someone else's thoughts. When at last she found her voice, it was thin and cracked. "I didn't write it," she whispered. "I swear I didn't, but someone wants me blamed." Purbright looked around the hall at the faces. Triumphant, fearful, gleeful. The town was an audience hungry for its final act. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "see Mrs. Babel-Smith to the station. We must keep her safe. From others and from herself. The play is reaching its end, but the author has not yet bowed." As the crowd spilled into the drizzle, Purbright lingered a moment by the stage. The hat-box machine, confiscated, sat on a table nearby, its reels now empty. He touched it lightly, as if it were an actor waiting to be recalled. "Theatre," he murmured, "is dangerous when it forgets it is only play. And Flaxborough, I fear, has forgotten." Love rejoined him. "So who, sir? If not the counsellor, not his wife, not Mrs. Clee, who else?" Purbright gave his small, patient smile. Why, Sergeant, that is what Act 3 is for. Tomorrow we shall invite them all again, and this time there will be no interval. The guilty party will find that applause can sometimes sound very like handcuffs. And with that, he stepped out into the rain, leaving the rehearsal hall behind him, its echoes full of whispers, suspicion, and the certainty that the last curtain was waiting to fall. The drizzle that had dampened Flaxborough the night before thickened into a steady rain by morning, as if the town itself had decided to wash its hands of the whole affair. But the rain did not cleanse the gossip. If anything, it multiplied it. Shopkeepers served tea with theories, bus conductors corrected passengers with rumors, and the barber offered haircuts with commentary on the likelihood of Daphne Babel-Smith fainting out of guilt. At the police station, Purbright sat at his desk, while Sergeant Love paced like a man rehearsing his lines for an argument he feared he might lose. "Sir," Love said at last, "this can't go on. We have Mrs. Babel-Smith under watch, the counsellor still spluttering in a cell, and half the town ready to swear Beryl Clee masterminded the lot. The case is beginning to look like a pantomime." Purbright stirred his tea with such unhurried delicacy that it seemed he might never answer. At length he said, "Pantomime is not far from truth in Flaxborough, Sergeant. Here people dress as what they wish to be, and the audience applauds regardless of whether the costumes fit. Our task is only to see who wrote the script." Love stopped pacing. "And you think we've not yet met our playwright?" "I think," said Purbright softly, "that the playwright is about to demand an encore." He was not wrong. Before noon another envelope arrived, this one without edging of any kind, plain white, as though the dramatist had abandoned mourning for anticipation. Inside was a single card bearing a typed message. "Tonight, final act, Market Hall. Clock strikes 10, all present." Love groaned. "Another performance. Do we indulge them, sir?" Purbright tapped the card with his forefinger. "Indulge. We attend, because the curtain will fall with or without us, and I prefer to be in the audience rather than in the obituary." By evening, the market hall was once again filled. Rain glistened on coats and umbrellas. The air smelled of damp wool and nervousness. The mayor bustled in, eager to appear in charge. Mrs. Clee arrived with an expression halfway between martyrdom and celebrity. Dora Liversedge came armed with her fox collar like armor. Daphne Babel-Smith, pale but composed, was escorted by her husband, whose indignation looked more like exhaustion. Mr. Clegg, grave as always, hovered near the coffin he had sworn never again to lend, while Huggins lurked beside him, mustache trembling. The dramatic society, sensing both danger and opportunity, had turned out in force, whispering and clutching programs as though uncertain whether they were to perform or be accused. At precisely 10, the market hall clock chimed, honest to the minute since Purbright's correction. The sound carried through the hall with a resonance that silenced every whisper. Purbright stepped forward, his manner so mild that one might almost forget why they were there. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this town has seen much these past days. Screams, coffins, vanishing ladies, pig's blood, crypt confinements, accusations, and applause. Yet we still lack one thing: honesty. Tonight we shall supply it." He paused, letting the quiet deepen. "Our culprit is here among us. They have left notes, props, and performances. They have used Mrs. Clee as their instrument, Mrs. Liversedge as their diversion, Councillor Babel-Smith as their stooge, and the Dramatic Society as their prop cupboard. But the true author of this play is—" A scream cut him off. All heads turned. At the back of the hall, the coffin, Clegg's polished Victorian piece, had shifted. Its lid trembled. Another scream, muffled, rose from within. Gasps ran through the crowd. The mayor dropped his rosette pin again. Mrs. Prowse clutched her prayer book. Love rushed forward, but Purbright raised a hand. "Wait, let the play run." The scream came again, followed by frantic thudding. At Purbright's nod, Love and Thacker opened the coffin. Inside lay another bundle of white satin, another tape machine, another lipstick-scrawled note on the lid. Last act. Applause required. The crowd, half terrified, half delighted, erupted in chatter. Mrs. Clee shouted, "It's another trick." Dora cried, "It's her again." Daphne turned paler still, and Babel Smith groaned as though carrying the world's indignities. Purbright lifted the machine and held it aloft. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, the same contraption. This scream is no more real than the first, but the message is clear. Someone wanted us gathered here at this hour to witness their finale." He set the machine down and turned slowly toward the hall. "And I think we owe them their applause. For our playwright is—" The door at the far end banged open. Every head swung. In walked Mr. Gedge, the station master, cap in hand, face solemn. At his side, as though he had been persuaded only with difficulty, shuffled a man in shabby suit and muffler. Mr. Liversedge, Dora's husband. The crowd rippled with shock. Dora gasped, half anger, half something else. Purbright inclined his head. "Huh? Our missing stagehand." Love looked baffled. "Liversedge, sir?" "Yes, Sergeant. Consider who had access to the station buffet, the left luggage office, the coal yard. Who knew Mrs. Clee's habits, envied her chatter, resented her gossip. Who could move unseen where others would be noticed. Our quietest man." Liversedge muttered. "Didn't mean harm." His eyes darted like trapped mice. Dora cried, "You fool! What have you done?" Purbright's voice was calm. "He built the contraptions. He planted the basket. He wrote the notes with lipstick borrowed from his wife's dressing table. But he was not alone. He had direction. He had a producer." He turned, eyes resting at last on Mrs. Clee. She flushed crimson. "Me, Inspector, how dare you? I was the victim." "Victim." Purbright's tone was gentle, almost sorrowful. "No, madam. You were the star. You entered willingly into the hoax, expecting applause. But when your accomplice, poor Mr. Liversedge, proved too clumsy, you let suspicion drift toward others. Yet the hand, arranging every scene, demanding every interval, was yours. You wished the town to pay attention, to pay the respect it had denied since the great Sponge affair. 11 years you have brooded, and at last you staged your revenge." The hall gasped. Dora gave a strangled laugh of vindication. Daphne Babel Smith exhaled in visible relief. The mayor muttered something about sandwiches. Mrs. Clee shook with indignation. "It's a lie! I never—" Purbright raised the final envelope, produced that morning. It bore no name, only a grease stain shaped suspiciously like a sandwich. Inside was the note, "Curtain at 10. The buffet is closed." He placed it on the coffin lid. "Your handwriting, Mrs. Clee, and your joke. Only you speak of buffets as though they were life and death. You believed the town owed you its stage. And with Mr. Liversedge's clumsy assistance, you took it." She collapsed into her chair, handbag slipping, sandwiches scattering. "I only wanted them to notice," she whispered. Purbright's voice remained kind. "They have noticed, madam. But applause can sometimes sound like laughter, and laughter in Flaxborough is rarely kind." The hall emptied slowly, buzzing with commentary, scandal already fermenting. Mrs. Clee was escorted away, shoulders stiff but chin trembling. Mr. Liversedge, pale and bewildered, shuffled beside her. Dora walked behind, fox collar triumphant, though her eyes betrayed an unease deeper than triumph. The dramatic society dispersed in relief that the play had ended without implicating them further. Daphne Babel Smith, regal once more, took her husband's arm and led him out with the grace of a woman determined to edit her own part. Only Purbright lingered, gazing at the now silent coffin. Love approached, relief etched in his features. "Well, sir, that's the curtain then." Purbright smiled faintly. Curtain, yes. But plays linger in memory longer than they deserve. Tomorrow the town will tell itself that it knew from the first. It will embroider, exaggerate, and soften. And in 11 years, time, who knows? Someone may stage it all again. Love groaned. Heaven forbid. Purbright replaced his hat. Heaven rarely interferes in Flaxborough, Sergeant. That duty falls, alas, to us. Together they stepped out into the rain-slick square, the market hall clock chiming once more, honest at last but still eyed with suspicion by a town that preferred its time wrong if it suited the story. The rain slackened, and Flaxborough, which never rushed to absolution, decided to be damp instead. By noon the next day, the barber had fashioned 3 separate versions of the story to suit 3 kinds of customer. The ladies at Oxfam had agreed to keep the fox fur in a drawer until feelings subside, and the yellow lion was pouring pints beneath a chalkboard that read, with prideful impartiality, "We serve all sides of any scandal." At the station, Purbright wrote, which is the inspector's way of doing. He arranged facts on the page with the same kindness he showed to people, even when those facts were uncompromising. Sergeant Love, who believed in conclusions the way some men believe in breakfast, watched the pen move and only occasionally interrupted to ensure that the human race had not changed in the last 5 minutes. "It sits, sir," he said at last, "but I can't say it sits comfortably. Mrs. Clee as author, Liversedge as stagehand, Babel Smith as eager stooge. The society as prop room, Dora as diversion. It adds up, but like a sum done by a child with personality." Purbright said without looking up. "Most sums, Sergeant, are done by such children. We call it ambition when they will not stop at arithmetic." Statements, once taken, could be placed like furniture in a room and lived with until they looked inevitable. Mrs. Clee's, when it came, was a piece upholstered in indignation. She sat squarely, handbag beside her as if it might require counsel, and recited with the crispness of a woman who has taken many orders and believes this entitles her to give one. "They asked me," she began, Daphne and 2 of the society's more literate admirers, "to lend a little art to the show. A stunt. Their word. I said the town likes a start and a laugh. They said scream and disappear, reappear next day, collect applause. I agreed. Why shouldn't I? It harms no one to have a scream if there's tea after. I did not ask for blood, nor for crypts. I was put in that hole and left without so much as a flask, and I'll remember that in my will." "Who put you there?" Love asked. "A friend," she said tartly, which turned out to be Mr. Liversedge translated into Flaxborough. "He knows the station as if it were his own sitting room. He says yes when he ought to say nothing. I told him how to fetch the satins and who to borrow the machine from and how to set a clock. He did the running, I did the thinking. That's a partnership where I come from." "You wrote the lid message," Love said. "I wrote a lot of things," she returned with reluctant pride. "You try writing backwards on a varnished surface with a lipstick that sulks. I'm not dead yet," seemed to me to be succinct. "Succinct," murmured Purbright and made a note. "And the wintergreen." "Courage," she said, almost good-humored. "I don't deny I took a nip. People talk about nerves like they're furniture. Mine are in use all day. A little wintergreen, a little breath. I wasn't born screaming in coffins, you know." "And Mrs. Liversedge?" Love demanded. "Why kidnap her?" Mrs. Clee drew herself up, affronted by the verb. "I never told him to kidnap anybody. I said, Dora's been sniping 3 years. Shut her up for 3 hours. That's a phrase. In my trade we all say it. He took it literal. Men do. He put her in a box and called it courtesy. If anyone owes anybody, he owes me for the noise." "Do you feel owed, Mrs. Clee?" Purbright asked. So gently the question looked like conversation. She stared at him, hunting for the trap and finding only attention. "Since the great sponge," she said. They laughed. They always laugh. Mrs. Clee and her bought cakes, Mrs. Clee and her long intervals. 11 years and I've never heard the end. So I made them listen properly. I was to come out of the crypt bang and give them my piece. They'd have clapped, Inspector. Oh, they'd have clapped. And when it began to look less like a prank and more like a charge sheet, Purbright said. She hesitated, and there it was, the seam where pride became fear. I thought, she admitted, if they preferred tragedy, I'd give them tragedy. Let the counselor take a bow, if he wanted it. He was waving himself about in the wings already. A man who likes clocks can be trusted to be on time to be blamed. Did you plant the mayor's rosette? Love asked, not quite able to keep satisfaction from his voice. Mrs. Clee's mouth twitched. I dropped it for him, she said. Men lose things when you tidy for them. Why shouldn't mayors? And the last note, Purbright said, producing the white card. Curtain at 10. The buffet is closed. She looked at it a long time, the smallest of smiles arriving and apologizing. I thought that was neat, she said, but then I've always had a way with a sign. When she had gone, diminished only in the way healthy people are diminished by airless rooms, Love said. She's proud of it, even the bits that hurt her. People will forgive themselves any injury if it proves their point, Purbright said. He tidied the statement and put it where it could be found without triumph. Charge her with public mischief, causing a nuisance, wasting police time, and, if the clerk must enjoy himself, conspiracy to play at funerals. Mr. Liversedge, assault and unlawful confinement, tempered by the fact that he thought he was being gallant. Bail for both, if the magistrate can bear. It, Councillor Babble-Smith. He paused, the pen hovering like a mild bird. A caution for tampering with the clock and for lending vanity to other people's schemes. Daphne, said Love. She will resign her chair for health, which in Flaxborough is the only respectable illness, Purbright replied. And she will be kinder to her husband for a fortnight. And Dora. Dora will parade down the high street until she is bored of being congratulated for surviving what she would have survived in her sleep. Then she will discover she misses being necessary and will pick quarrels to restore equilibrium at home. Love smiled despite himself. You do people in paragraphs, sir. If one cannot have justice, Purbright said, it is useful to have description. Gedge supplied his contribution with mournful efficiency. He had noticed Liversedge trying to return a coil of satin to a cupboard he hadn't the key for. He had thought nothing of a hat box because hat boxes were dignified things. He had carried the weight of other people's arrangements all his life and saw no reason to drop any now. There's a lot of theatre at stations, he observed. People arrive pretending they are who they hope to be. Mr. Clegg, when visited in his parlour, placed a small glass of something respectful at Purbright's elbow and listened without a twitch. Trades are ruined by humour, he said at last, as if delivering a doctrine. We do not jest with boxes, but we live in towns that do. If you can use my van again for anything civic that is not this, Inspector, I shall be obliged. I'd rather use your sense, Purbright said, standing, but vans are notoriously more available. The Dramatic Society sent a letter written in many hands, each of which denied complicity with a different flourish. They attached a schedule for their next production. A cheerful farce in 3 acts proceeds toward the repair of the Market Hall clock. Purbright returned it with a note suggesting a 1-act play, shorter, less liable to inspire municipal incidents. Daphne Babble-Smith wrote on embossed paper to say she would withdraw from public life until things are kinder, which most read as until people supply new things. She sent a bolt of ribbon for the police fete, stamped with a gold oval that declined to blush. The mayor made a short speech in which he congratulated the town on its courage in facing what had been loud, wrong, and entertaining. He said that lessons had been learned, though he could not be drawn on which. He polished his rosette and swore not to lend it again except to the national interest. By Friday, a notice hung in the station buffet. No theatricals during service hours. Beryl. Beneath it, in another hand with timid stiffness, Someone had added, "except tea." Customers laughed in cups. Liversedge. The town found that it could bear both lines. That evening, when the week had at last lowered itself into its chair, Purbright went walking along the river, where the water arranged itself with the patience of a clerk copying out a long name. He watched the reflections of lamps shiver when the current contradicted them and thought about clocks. Flaxborough preferred its wrong ones. They provided the intervals it wanted and the excuses it needed. Putting them right was a civic virtue, but it made people nervous, as if truth were a draft they hadn't dressed for. He thought, too, of debt. Not money, which is only numbers instructing envelopes. Reputation, which is numbers instructing faces. The town had owed Beryl Clee what it never pays, the courtesy of believing her ordinary. She had exacted attention instead. It is the commonest revenge and the costliest. People forgive theft before they forgive being bored. On his return, the office smelt of paper and rain. Love had left a neat stack of forms with tabs of penciled headings: charge, bail, property, like little flags of surrender. On the corner of the blotter lay the cards the town had sent. Interval, no flowers. Close the lid. Act 2. Curtain. They read now like lines addressed to nobody. Purbright, who disliked litter with personality, put them in an envelope for the file and wrote on it in an even hand, "Flaxborough, Coffin, miscellaneous." He signed off the last page of his report, the way one signs a letter to an acquaintance one hopes to see less of. Then he sat a moment with his eyes closed, not in prayer but in that idle precision by which the tidy prepare tomorrow. He thought of the smallness of the odd detail that had begun it for him, the wintergreen at the wrong time, the lipstick where satin disrespected fingers, the hill of a clock that preferred to be late for truth and early for tea. None of them large, all of them domestic, the very furniture of mischief. Sergeant Love came to the door, knocked as people do who have been told they needn't, and looked relieved to find the world still arranged. "The station buffet's open, sir," he said. "Gedge says there's jam. Mrs. Clee's serving with an air of mercy. Liversedge is carrying trays like a penitent angel." "Then we have our liturgy back," Purbright said, standing. "Let us go and witness the sacrament." They walked out into a town that had resumed, like a tune remembered. The market hall clock chimed properly and vainly. In the square a child practiced a scream that made his mother laugh, and then hush. A cat slipped into the ironmonger's and emerged with nothing it would confess. The vicar's wife, who had ceased to be pale and returned to the colour of authority, bought 2 scones and distributed them in a manner indistinguishable from morality. At the buffet, faces turned with that agreeable self-consciousness by which towns welcome their own continuance. Beryl, wearing a stare that dared forgiveness to be mean, slid plates along the counter with an efficiency that might have raised armies. She saw Purbright and inclined her head the smallest degree by which sovereigns abdicate in private. "Inspector," she said, "tea, or are you still on the side of law?" "Tea," said Purbright. "Law is best taken with it." She poured, and Liversedge, moving carefully in a world where movement had lately meant boxes, delivered cups with hands that had learned another use for politeness. Dora, arriving on a draught of perfume and triumph, chose a table from which she could be seen forgiving. Daphne entered with a smile that had mastered pallor and made it a style. The mayor looked at the clock and decided to be on time by it. Love blew on his tea and said, in the tone of a man re-entering a room he'd left in order, "It turns out, sir, that Flaxborough prefers farce to tragedy." "It prefers a familiar end," Purbright said. "Farce supplies one. Tragedy asks too much of the audience." Outside, the rain had stopped pretending to be thoughtful and become air again. The inspector glanced through the steamed glass and saw the town reflected there, its fronts and its backs, its costumes and its faces, the polite persuasions by which it persuaded itself that it was better today than yesterday. He did not argue. He took his tea, paid in exact change, and felt very slightly that the clock had been put right for as long as it could bear. He returned to his desk and to the paperwork that follows applause, and when he wrote the final line of the final page, he did so with the same quiet certainty with which he had greeted the first scream, knowing that the town would provide another play in another season, and that he would, without rush or relish, take his seat when asked. The end.